Hello, I'm David Pendergrass, the pastor of discipleship here at First Methodist West Chase. I'm so glad you're taking the time again to watch one of these videos. So far we've covered several things. Hopefully in your D group we've covered a lot of ground. We've covered the need to interpret of chapter 1, the need to get a good translation of the Bible, and of course a little bit of how a translation process works for the Bible. We looked last week at how the Old Testament narratives are to be used. And we're not looking for the moral of the story, perhaps. We're looking rather for what it tells us about God and how God works in history. I would encourage you again this week that if new people come to your group, do your best to make certain they feel as comfortable as possible. Try your best to have either name tags or something around your neck or something that makes sure people can see what your name is. If they need a Bible, get them a Bible in their hands or sit next to someone who has one. Make sure they feel as welcome as possible. Secondly, I also want to encourage you. This is usually about the time early in this study when people can feel, if not already, a bit overwhelmed. Not, like I said before, not everyone's accustomed to reading this kind of literature, and it might seem kind of dense to them. I want to encourage you to encourage them not to give up. We won't remember every bit of this, every word of this. That's okay. If we try to get a few nuggets from every single chapter, it'd be worth your time. And it's always possible to go back and look over this outline in the future. So try to do your best each time the D group meets to encourage them. Say, don't give up. Stay in there. Try to do your reading. And this does pay off. It has real-world Christian application results. It really does. And today is no exception. Let's talk about chapter 9, the law, covenant stipulations for Israel. Now, the law comes from what we might call the first 5 books of the Bible, typically called Torah. Torah comes from a Hebrew word in footnote number 6. It comes from a Hebrew word which means to throw, but it's throw guidance. If someone asked me, how do I get to San Antonio, and I picked up this pen and I threw it, and it went that direction and fell on the ground, I would say I threw that, I gave direction. That's the root of the word for Torah, to show guidance. Law is a possible translation, but now you see how it misses out. Law is more about just stipulations. But to guide someone is to get them to a certain direction. And that's what Torah means, and that's what it was for. And God gave the Israelites this guide, this, you might say, almost a religious constitution. He gave it to them to establish, like I say, number 1 here, proper moral behavior. Proper moral behavior with each other. So one of the chief functions of the Torah is to help ancient Jews relate well to one another. Secondly, is to establish proper worship of Yahweh. It's God's way of saying, this is what makes me happy. Thirdly, it's to establish proper limits or boundaries between the Jewish group and everybody else. I cannot overemphasize these 3 aspects. Bullet point number 1. I cannot overemphasize it. Every time you and I read anything from the law, especially the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, we have to keep these 3 things in mind. It will help us not read it like it's a 21st century text or that it's written to Americans or Westerners or just white people or Asian people and so forth. But rather, it's a particular document or collection of documents written to people who lived nearly 3,000 years ago to help govern their lifestyle with each other, toward God, and toward those on the outside. Now, they can sound very bizarre to us. For example, in Deuteronomy 14:21, not cooking a young goat in its mother's milk. Now, when I was a teenager, I had a bad problem with that, but since Jesus has come in my life, I'm just teasing, of course not. So it sounds crazy to us. Who would do that? Well, the reason why people did that back in the ancient world, these kinds of laws that might sound strange, on the one hand, it's because it's for health reasons. Pork and so forth, they ate dirty, nasty things, so they didn't eat pork. But on the other hand, there were some rituals that sound perhaps even more bizarre, like this goat milk and not putting 2 crops together and so forth. The reason why they did that, or rather they were commanded not to do it, is because their neighbors did do it. And most of the neighbors of ancient Judaism were the Canaanites, we call them. Canaanites is a broad term which encapsulates several different people groups all around the northern part of Israel and the southern part of Israel, all the way to Egypt. There are a whole group of peoples all around them, and they had all kinds of rituals that took place. One of the most popular gods of the time, his name was Baal. If you're from Texas, you say Baal, but it's Baal, and it means Lord or Sir or Master. Now, Baal had a lover, and the idea was you had to do certain things to get these gods to wake up. You might have sex at the temple with a temple prostitute. You might burn certain things or cook certain things a certain way. You might eat certain food or drink certain drink in order to get the gods to perk up and get their attention, so that you got crops, so that you had babies born, you had victory in war. So these prohibitions against the Jews that sound so weird to us made perfect sense to them. Perfect sense to them. So it's important for us not to dismiss them all and so forth. That's all ridiculous nowadays. Of course, we don't have that problem today. But the idea of God that we learn from it is that God cares very much for ancient Jews, and then for us today as well, about purity. About purity. And the idea that other gods might bless us. Many people around the world, in fact, might go to a Jewish rabbi, a Christian priest, Native American shaman, just to kind of get all the bases covered, get a lot of little blessings. The ancient Christians used to do this too. They thought that the rabbis offered really good blessings, and they would go and hire rabbis to go bless their land. And the Christian ministers, like one pastor named John Chrysostom of the 3rd and 4th century, he got so upset about this. It's the idea that we kind of pick and choose different spiritual supermarket in the hopes that someone's God will perk up and help us. That's what they're prohibiting over and over again in the law. Ancient Jews, God would say, are not to do that. Of course, we Christians today would pick up on the same point. Number 2, Christians are not expected to express our loyalty to God by keeping the Old Testament laws, since Christians are under a different covenant. Now, how do we understand the Old Testament then? What do we do with the law? Well, that's a good question. And the church from the very beginning started by practice and theology having some common customs of what to do with the Old Testament law. And so there's no book written, there's nothing, scholars don't have a separate book given down from heaven that we read and so forth, but rather a broad church practice occurred. And that was that they would break up the law into 3 major categories. There are civil laws that have to do with how to deal with various penalties. If I'm walking down the road and I fall in a hole and it's on your land, do you owe me money if you break my leg? If my donkey is on Pastor Paul's land, and I didn't break, it broke loose on this rope on its own, but it gets to Pastor Paul's land, and it falls down and breaks his leg, does Paul owe me money? And those kind of legal issues, that they dealt with those things. Then there are ritual laws. That has to do with worship. Now, an enormous amount of the Old Testament law is about that. An enormous amount of it. It has to do with what to do at the temple. And it's interesting, we don't have much time now, but it's interesting how many laws that are specifically given for Jews at the temple that Christians today still think they should uphold. But the third one is the moral law, and that's what most Christians would say, of course, that's what we maintain. That if there's a moral law of how to treat other people, and it's upheld in the New Testament, then that's something we latch on to. So on page 19, number 3, this is crucial. In general, Christians should assume that none of the laws are binding unless they are renewed or restated in the New Testament. So we're looking for laws that are renewed or restated, either implicitly or explicitly. Now, of course, this means very few laws are applicable for the Christian. Very few. There are certainly moral laws that uphold, but very few of the other laws, civil and ritual or cultic or religious, have to do with us today. That's very important to remember. So it'll help you interpret the Old Testament law even better. Roman number 3. This is a key point of contention in the church for, I'd say, at least 500 years. And there's more to it than this, but I'll say enough here, and then maybe over time you and I could discuss this, or if you have problems in your D group, I'll be happy to talk about this more. But the Israelites, according to the Old Testament and early church Jewish tradition, Israelites did not consider the law a means of salvation. They did not. Jews thought that the law was given to them as an act of grace, like $1 million lottery ticket plopped in their lap. We have no reason to think that most of the Jews, now did some Jews, do they think that? Maybe so. Maybe so. By the time of Jesus, we think that perhaps some did think such a thing. But in general, we don't have evidence that Jews thought the law some heavy, burdensome, miserable thing. In fact, they celebrate the law all the time. There are multiple psalms that do nothing but record jubilee over the law of God and how it sets one free. It's an act of grace. A covenant is like a marriage vow. Marriage covenant together. I made vows to my wife, she made vows to me. I do not act out my vows in order to earn my marriage or to earn my wife's love. That's why I buy her chocolate. But I obey, of course not. I obey my vows because I'm trying to demonstrate that I'm married. I'm demonstrating my marriage to Elaine by obeying the marriage vows I made. In general, that's how Jews viewed the law, not as a means of salvation. It didn't earn them salvation, but rather they obeyed the law because it demonstrated they were part of the people of God. They had a covenant with God, and they wanted to demonstrate it. Row number 4, and this is last, but not least, page 20. Like with the Hebrew narratives, we should always ask of the laws, what does this tell me about God and what He's done in history? What does this tell me about God? Things such as the purity laws tell me how God cares very much for purity and the role of sin and purity in a person's life. It tells us a whole lot about how they're to treat one another. And there's so much more here, but one of the things that's staggering about the Old Testament law was how they stood out in contradistinction to their neighbors. For example, ancient Jews had numerous prohibitions toward the Jews about not hurting an alien or a slave. Alien not from Mars, but of course a foreigner. About how they should take care of foreigners and provide for their needs. No other cultures did that. So there's an enormous amount of laws that provide for the victim, the powerless, the poor, the hungry. And those things demonstrate the kind of God who is. And of course that's demonstrated very much in the life of Jesus and the early church. I encourage you to think about those questions every time you read any kind of literature at all, but certainly when it comes to Old Testament law. Now, the last bullet point says, and I do encourage you to do this, to turn to page 180 in your book and read this list aloud. And maybe call on someone to read it, or you all take turns, but be sure to read this list aloud and discuss these principles if you have any questions about it. God bless you. Thank you for your hard work. Thank you for loving God's people so well in your D group. Don't forget, we are all about making disciples, loving and growing in our mind, our heart, and our bodies. Keep up the good work. Be encouraged. I'll see you next week.